5,000 years ago, a lone scribe presses a sharpened reed into a damp clay tablet. In careful, practiced strokes, he records the day's grain deliveries to the temple granary. As the clay fills with neat rows of wedge-shaped symbols, he sets the tablet aside to dry. One more piece of preserved knowledge, all finished up. The job is done. Such a scene could have unfolded 5 millennia ago in ancient Mesopotamia, long before the famed Library of Alexandria or the scroll-stacked libraries of Greece and Rome. Bronze Age civilizations were pioneering the collection of knowledge. In the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, the peoples of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, and Minoan Crete had already developed writing systems and began to populate the world's first libraries, archives of clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and inscriptions that safeguarded everything from mundane accounts to myths of creation. But these libraries were not public institutions as we think of libraries today. They were rather repositories of collective memory, temple collections, royal archives, scribal workshops, where human thought was preserved for future generations. The story of the first libraries is a journey into the very dawn of writing itself, when humanity learned how to make words last across time. And so today, it's all about how Bronze Age people collected and stored knowledge. We'll go through Sumeria, Babylonia, Egypt, all the old scribal schools, and Indus Valley merchant offices too, Minoan palace storerooms, and beyond. And we'll see how the invention of writing, cuneiform wedges, hieroglyphic signs, enigmatic Indus symbols, and even linear A strokes lost to time enabled information to be recorded for posterity. By the end, I think we'll appreciate how these Bronze Age knowledge centers, certainly modest in form, yet monumental in legacy, laid the foundation for humanity's enduring pursuit of learning. And that's why you're here, isn't it? The pursuit of learning. I hope so. Let me welcome you first. If you're a newcomer, it's good to meet you. Truly. If you're coming back, it's good to see you again. Thank you dearly to those supporting on the Patreon, and those who took the time to check out the merch store. And thank you in advance for clicking that subscribe button, which is right next to the like button. Thank you. Now, without any further ado, let's get on to the topic for today. Nice and relaxed. We'll go really slow. So, the roots of the first libraries lie in the invention of writing itself. That only makes sense, doesn't it? During the early Bronze Age, we're talking late 4th to early 3rd millennium BCE, multiple civilizations independently developed writing systems as a means to record information. In Mesopotamia, that is the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians invented cuneiform writing around 3400 to 3200 BC. Cuneiform began as a pictographic marks and numerical impressions left into clay tablets mainly to track goods and transactions. Boring stuff, accounting. But over time, these symbols became a bit more abstract and even syllabic, capable of recording complex language. Little by little, it was changing. But Mesopotamia wasn't the only advanced civilization for that time. In ancient Egypt, a wholly separate writing system was taking place. Hieroglyphics. They emerged around 32 to 3000 BC. That's 3200 to 3000 BC, as evidenced in the inscribed tags and pottery from the tomb of proto-dynastic rulers. Egyptian hieroglyphs were sacred pictorial characters used on monuments, You know the ones. But there was also a cursive derivative called hieratic that was developed for everyday writing on papyrus. It's not as well known, but you'll probably recognize it if you saw it. But writing was by no means a Mediterranean phenomenon. Far to the east, the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished from 2500 to 1900 BC, created an interesting script of its own. Archaeologists have uncovered symbols of distinct Indus writing on sealed stones, pottery, and bronze tools. These symbols, typically only a few characters long, likely represent a writing or proto-writing system, though it remains undeciphered to this day, at least at the time of doing this video. It'd be a little embarrassing if they deciphered it within the next few days, but that's okay. Well, in the Aegean, the people of Minoan Crete developed writing a little bit later. First, a set of pictographs, that is, Cretan hieroglyphs around 2000 to 1700 BC, and then a linear script in use by roughly 1800 BCE, that being Linear A. Now, Linear A is still undeciphered, but demonstrates that even in Bronze Age Europe, writing had taken root. It's just a shame we don't understand it yet. By around 2000 BC, multiple Bronze Age civilizations were fully literate, each using scripts tailored to their language and needs. That is not to say that the common people were fully literate, but the administration certainly was. Now you must remember, these early writing systems almost universally arose for pragmatic reasons only. No one in those early days was writing down big stories and all the rest, at least none that we've found. That would come a little bit later. They were chiefly used to facilitate administration, governance, and trade, record keeping, things like this. In Mesopotamia, early cuneiform tablets were essentially tools of the accountants. We've got tons of them, literally tons. Lists of grain deliveries, tallies of livestock, trade inventories, things like that. Likewise, in Egypt, the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions often accompanied economic records or labels of royal possessions. This practical origin of writing meant that from the very beginning, written documents accumulated in significant numbers. Once a tablet or papyrus had served its immediate purpose, recording a transaction or a decree, it was often stored rather than discarded, in case it needed to be referred to later. Thus, temples, palaces, and administrative offices gradually amassed archives of written records. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, these archives had grown large enough that we can legitimately call them the first libraries. The first libraries were essentially archives of the earliest forms of writing, collections of clay documents in Sumerian temple storerooms and palaces such as Ebla in Syria. Basically, history begins with the library, since the preservation of written records marks the transition from prehistory, that is, the time of no written accounts, to documented history. Each early civilization's writing system provided the foundation for storing their knowledge, and the creation of archives naturally followed the spread of literacy. So next, we turn to how these early records were physically made and preserved, the ingenious techniques Bronze Age people used to ensure their words would last. Of course, writing in the Bronze Age was constrained and shaped by whatever materials were available. Different civilizations adopted different writing media, each with its own methods of preservation, and these choices deeply influenced how their libraries developed. The two most important writing materials of the Bronze Age were clay and papyrus, corresponding broadly to Mesopotamia and Egypt respectively, while other media like stone, metal, or wood were used, but in specific context. Well, let's have a look first at the most quintessential images of the Bronze Age, those clay tablets in Mesopotamia. Of course, that was the medium of choice for recording information. Scribes would scoop up a lump of fine clay and flatten it into a tablet, typically about an inch thick. While the clay was still damp, they used a stylus, often a sharpened reed, to press symbols into the surface, creating the wedge-shaped imprints characteristic of cuneiform writing. These clay tablets varied in size and shape. Some were small enough to fit in a hand, used for simple receipts, while others were larger rectangular plaques, used for long texts or multi-column documents. Once inscribed, a tablet could be left to dry in the sun, hardening to a leathery firmness, or baked in a kiln for a permanent stone-like finish. Thousands of tablets like this have survived across the millennia, often preserved by fire. Now here's an ironic one. The destructive fires that burned cities in antiquity frequently baked the clay tablets in archives, firing them to a ceramic hardness that ensured their survival. For example, when the city of Ebla was violently destroyed in 2300 BC, the palace archives fell from their shelves and were accidentally baked in the conflagration, preserving them for modern archaeologists. They tried to wipe Ebla from history, but ironically the attempt basically firmed all the tablets, and, well, here we are. Very ironic. Now, clay tablets were special because they were durable, but they were also bulky and heavy. Storing and organizing such materials required quite a bit of ingenuity. Archaeological excavations have revealed that tablets in Mesopotamian archives were often kept on wooden racks or shelves, or even in large jars and baskets. Smaller tablets could be stacked on edge side by side with brief titles or labels written along the edge so that one could read the spines, I suppose, of the tablets on a shelf. Remarkably analogous to how modern libraries label book spines, if you think about it. Clay also allowed scribes to make envelope-like cases. For instance, a contract could be written on a tablet, then wrapped in an outer layer of clay, bearing a duplicate inscription, and sealed. An ancient security envelope, I suppose. The physical toughness of clay and the practice of archiving tablets in official centers meant that Mesopotamia's earliest libraries could endure for centuries. Indeed, clay tablets from over 4,000 years ago still legibly bear the handwriting of a Sumerian and Babylonian scribe, even to this day. And that's just amazing. Now on to ancient Egypt. They weren't really using clay. They had a different medium, papyrus. It's a paper-like material made from the pith of a papyrus reed, which grew abundantly along the Nile, so it only makes sense that they use what they have. By the early Bronze Age, as 3000 BC or around then, Egyptians had learned to cut papyrus reeds into thin strips, and then press and dry them into sheets, and join the sheets into long rolls, creating flexible scrolls ideal for writing with pen and ink. The Egyptian scribes used brushes or reed pens dipped in carbon-based ink to write on papyrus. They usually wrote in cursive scripts, hieratic for most of the Bronze Age, later demotic, rather than in the more formal hieroglyphs when using papyrus. Papyrus scrolls had significant advantages. They were light, portable, and could contain much more text than a single clay tablet. The scroll could be rolled up and tied with a small tag or ink label identifying its contents. This portability likely contributed to a broader dissemination of writing in Egypt. One scholar notes that switching from clay to papyrus helped spur a great increase in writing in later periods, and it's hard to argue with that. It's certainly a lot easier to transport them. Paper weighs a bit less than the clay tablets. But it wasn't all good news. Papyrus was also perishable. Unlike the clay tablets that could literally survive the burning ruins of the city, papyrus was highly vulnerable, not just to fire, but moisture, and more importantly, as we sit here thousands of years later, it was vulnerable to time. Most Bronze Age papyri have come down to us as preserved only thanks to Egypt's dry climate and protective conditions of tombs and sealed jars. For instance, famous Egyptian texts like the Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1550 BC, and the Westcar Papyrus containing royal tales, survived by being buried or hidden. Countless others must have crumbled to the dust. So how did Egyptians store their papyrus documents? Archaeological and textual clues indicate that they used wooden chests, clay jars, and shelving niches in a temple or palace archive. In the city of Amarna, around 14th century BC, a storage chamber of the documents of pharaohs was discovered, complete with the remains of papyrus and labels, suggesting that bundles of scrolls were actually kept there. And then there's the tomb paintings that show scribes carrying scroll cases or boxes, indicating that important documents could be tied up with cords and placed in decorated chests. One vivid image is from the tomb of an 18th dynasty official, which depicts scribes recording the harvest. Nearby, spare scrolls or writing equipment are stored in a wooden box. Thus, while Mesopotamia's libraries were rooms full of clay tablets, Egypt's were more likely to be cupboards of scrolls within temple scriptoria or offices, carefully maintained by archivist priests. The fragility of papyrus meant Egyptian archives required careful protection from the humidity and insects. Occasionally, scrolls might be recopied onto new papyrus if the old ones had decayed. Other material also played roles in Bronze Age information. In the Indus Valley, many inscriptions were carved on small steatite seals, that's a soft stone, that could be impressed onto clay for marking goods. These seals, typically about the size of a postage stamp, often have drilled holes, indicating they might be worn or kept on strings. Perhaps an official's personal seal, combining identification with a bit of text. The Indus people may have also written on perishable materials, wood planks or palm leaves, but no such documents have survived. In Minoan Crete, aside from clay tablets, some inscriptions appear on metal goblets and stone vases, and the intriguing Phaistos disc, a fired clay disc stamped with pictograms, suggests experimentation with different formats. Additionally, both Egypt and Mesopotamia sometimes used ostraca, broken pottery shards, or limestone flakes as a cheap writing surface for notes and school exercises. For permanent records like royal decrees and commemorations, stone stelae were employed. The best example I can give you of this is probably Hammurabi's Law Code. That was a diorite stele inscribed around 1750 BC. There are a few others, but this is the most recognizable. These stone inscriptions are not really libraries in themselves, but they often existed alongside the archives, and sometimes copies of the same text would be kept on clay or papyrus in an archive. All to be told, Bronze Age civilization demonstrated impressive ingenuity in exploiting the available materials to store their knowledge. Whether incising damp clay, painting ink on reed paper, carving symbols into stone, they developed pretty robust techniques. And the techniques in turn influenced the form of early libraries. Mesopotamia's archives look like rooms of baked tablet stacks, while Egypt's look like collections of scrolls and seals all stuffed into little holes, each tailored to the medium of memory. But enough about the tablets. Who were the people behind the first libraries? Well, in every Bronze Age civilization, a specialized class of literate individuals emerged. Scribes. They became the primary creators, organizers, and guardians of written knowledge. They were essentially the human backbone of the early libraries, responsible for recording information and transmitting it across generations. By virtue of their education and role, they often became scholars in their own right, studying and copying older texts and contributing to a growing intellectual tradition. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes were highly esteemed professionals. It was a good job, but becoming a scribe, that required an extensive education. In Sumer, by the early dynastic period, around 2500 BC, formal scribal schools existed. The Sumerians even had a word for such school, eduba, meaning house of tablets. Isn't that interesting? At the eduba, student scribes, typically young men from good families, and by good families I mean families who had enough money to send them to the schools, though occasionally women and even enslaved students could be trained. They spent years mastering the art of writing on clay. They started by molding their own practice tablets and learning to press consistent wedge shapes. The curriculum then advanced through copying lists of signs, vocabulary, proverbs, and model documents. One ancient Mesopotamian school text, known simply as School Days, which I think is funny, is a fictionalized dialogue in which a student describes his daily routine of memorizing and reciting lessons, and even recounts being caned by his teacher for poor work, only to win back the teacher's favor with gifts and a well-copied tablet. It's interesting and a little bit humorous, I think, written by a scribe about his daily scribal life. But it also gives us a sense that the scribes were self-aware that they were a kind of distinct social group. By learning to write, they became employable in temples, palaces, and merchant offices throughout Mesopotamia. Initially, their tasks were utilitarian, keeping ledgers and accounts. But over time, scribes also took on the copying of literature, the drafting of letters, the recording of legal codes, and the compilation of lexical and scientific knowledge. Many Mesopotamian scribes were bilingual, or at least trained in the archaic languages. For example, first millennium Babylonian scribes had to learn the extinct Sumerian language to read and copy the old texts. As the custodians of written heritage, scribes often apprehended colophons to tablets, short, short notations rather, at the end of a text, stating who copied it, and sometimes where it was stored. These colophons are signatures of the Bronze Age librarians. Some even include proud little boasts, or prayers to the gods to protect the tablet. In one case we have a late Bronze Age Mesopotamian scribe named Amenadu. He left his name on a literary tablet, adding that whoever steals or damages it will incur the wrath of the gods. An early example of a librarian's caution against book theft, I suppose. Now what about Egypt? Well, they too were profoundly shaped by scribes. Ancient Egyptian scribes formed an elite class. They were the bureaucrats, record keepers, and intellectuals of their society. Training to be a scribe in Egypt, well, that began typically in youth, often with the confines of a temple or royal administrative office. Because Egyptian writing had complex hieroglyphic forms, students learned the simplified hieratic for daily use. Mastery of writing and reading opened the door to comfortable employment, and Egyptian texts consistently praised the profession of the scribe as one of great honor. A famous Middle Kingdom text known as the Satire of the Trades, which I have done a full reading on, it's in the Egypt playlist, is a didactic work that extols scribe's life above all other occupations. In this text, a father tells his son, quote, "Behold, there is nothing that surpasses writings. I shall make you love books more than your mother. It is indeed greater than any office. There is nothing like it on earth." Well, it seems kind of exaggerated for effect, but it reflects a kind of social reality that scribes were valued because all administration and culture depended on their skills. Egyptian scribes wrote letters for officials, drafted tax records, kept annals of kings, composed literary works, and copied religious texts. Many high officials, even some pharaohs, started their careers as scribes. Within the temples, there were special scriptoria known as the houses of life. In Egyptian, they call it per-ankh, which served as centers of learning and writing. Scribes attached to a house of life not only copied existing texts, for example, endlessly reproducing chapters of the Book of the Dead to be placed in tombs, but also edited and composed works of medicine, astronomy, theology, and ritual. They were effectively the librarians of those temple libraries. An inscription from one such institution lists titles like Chief of the House of Life, and even pairs of a scribe of the House of Life with a chief physician, indicating that scholarly knowledge, medical and otherwise, was curated there by scribes. So Egyptian scribes, just like their Mesopotamian counterparts, used catalogues and classification systems. In later periods, a library catalog papyrus from Edfu Temple lists scrolls by their first lines and counts, a precursor to library catalogues. While no catalog texts survive from the Bronze Age proper, the scale of organization implied by houses of life and storage chambers suggests that the Bronze Age Egyptian scribes were already managing collections systematically. And now to the Indus Valley. Well, because we cannot yet read their writing, we have no recorded names or personal accounts of their scribes. But we can infer that a class of specialists was responsible for carving the minute, standardized symbols on Indus seals and tablets. The consistency of the symbols across a vast area hints at training and a shared social scribal culture. The fact that Indus inscriptions have been found on crafted luxury items suggests that literate artisans were indeed respected. Perhaps they were merchant scribes who managed to trade records, or priests who inscribed tokens for ritual or identification purposes. The Indus cities, with their sophisticated urban planning and trade networks, undoubtedly required record keeping. One fascinating clue to their approach to written knowledge is the Dolavira signboard. At the city of Dolavira, archaeologists found 10 large alphabetic signs made of gypsum that had once been prominently mounted above the city's gate. Now this find, essentially a Bronze Age billboard, shows that the Indus script was not just used on personal seals, you see, but could appear in public displays. While, admittedly, we don't know what it actually said, the existence of a signboard hints that Indus scribes might have also kept records for public or communal use. The Indus Valley may not have had the libraries in the Mesopotamian sense. No archives of hundreds of tablets have been found there, at least not yet, but it's possible that they stored important documents on organic materials that decayed. Now, if that is the case, the scribes of Meluhha, as the Mesopotamians called the Indus region, have left behind a tantalizing mystery, a literate civilization whose books are lost to time, awaiting the day that we can decode the few inscriptions that remain. On Minoan Crete and in Mycenaean Greece, scribes were likewise central to administration and knowledge preservation. In the palace centers of Greece, Knossos, Phaistos, Zakros, etc., and later on mainland Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes, scribes kept meticulous records on clay tablets using Linear A and later Linear B. Minoan scribes writing in Linear A recorded primarily economic and administrative information. Excavations at sites like Knossos and Hyathraiota have uncovered rooms that once stored dozens or even hundreds of clay tablets, and that indicates a centralized archive. When the Mycenaeans took over Crete and adopted writing, they continued the scribal tradition. The Linear B archives of Knossos, 14th century BC, and Pylos in the 13th century show a highly standardized bureaucratic system. Scribes wrote in a jargon-heavy administrative language, using many standardized abbreviations and logograms for commodities, a clear sign of established scribal training. And they also used a form of cataloging. Tablets are often found with summary tablets that tally subtotals from many records, pointing to an internal filing system. Analysis does suggest that Minoan and Mycenaean scribes not only kept archives, but also issued and filed transactional documents, effectively acting as accountants and record managers. These Aegean scribes ensured that the wealth and resources of the kingdom, and even religious offerings to gods, were documented. Across all these cultures, scribes often doubled as scholars, librarians, and even scientists. They accumulated knowledge, and then had the responsibility to pass it on. In Mesopotamia, for example, advanced scribes compiled lexical lists, essentially encyclopedias and dictionaries of their time, containing lists of words, plants, animals, professions, and more, in multiple languages at that. They also copied and studied omens, star observations, and mathematical tablets. In Egypt, scribes produced wisdom literature, guides to ethics, and good conduct, along with technical manuals like medical papyri and mathematical texts. The scribe's reputation rested on both accuracy and erudition. A simple scribe might be expected to know administrative procedures, religious ritual texts, legal formulas, and even classic stories. Many scribes served the gods of writing: Nabu in Mesopotamia, Thoth or Seshat in Egypt. They often invoked these deities in colophons or prayers, symbolically linking their work to a divine mission of knowledge preservation. It is no exaggeration to say that the first libraries existed in the minds and hands of these scribes, for without their skill and care, the physical archives would have been nothing but unmarked clay and blank sheets of papyrus. So what exactly did these libraries hold? What kind of information? Well, there's a stereotype of a library as a place of literature. But the earliest libraries, despite what we've discussed in general about general record keeping, accounting, and all that, they're actually quite diverse in their content. Everything a civilization deemed worth writing down, basically. This included the prosaic alongside the poetic, the bureaucratic alongside the spiritual. Surviving tablets and texts from Bronze Age archives reveal a pretty rich tapestry of human concern, all the way from cosmology down to crop yields. So here are some of the main categories that were in the early libraries. Of course, by volume, the greatest portion is consisted of routine administrative documents, accounting ledgers, tax records, census lists, and labor rosters that kept an economy running even in ancient times. For instance, tablets from the Royal Archive of Ebla, which we have discussed, include inventories of textiles and metals, tribute lists from vassal towns, and disbursement records for bread and beer rations. In Egypt, papyri record the output of state workshops, the collection of grain and taxes, and the distribution of food to temple staff. Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece, as mentioned, left behind clay tablets that almost entirely document palace administration. Pretty dry accounts, I know, but they were the backbone of the first libraries because they needed to be stored for reference. Next we have legal and government documents. The archives also held laws, edicts, treaties, and correspondence related to governance. Mesopotamia has yielded some of the earliest known law collections. While the famous Code of Hammurabi is carved on stone, copies of laws and legal verdicts were also kept on clay tablets in city archives. In Hittite Anatolia, in the later Bronze Age, the archives of Hattusa, their capital, preserved treaties between the Hittite kings and the other states, showing libraries as political record rooms safeguarding important agreements. The palaces of ancient Egypt, they would similarly house decrees, sometimes duplicated on stelae for public display, but also kept on papyrus for internal record. Now religion, that was central to Bronze Age life too, and many early libraries were associated with temples. Thus a significant portion of their content was religious in nature. In Mesopotamia, temple and palace libraries contained numerous tablets of hymns to gods, rituals for festivals, and omen texts used for divination. Mesopotamian libraries also had creation myths and epics, such as the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'm sure you've heard of. I've done a full reading of that if you're interested. In Egypt, temple libraries, houses of life, kept ritual scrolls, prescribing on how to perform ceremonies as well as medical and magical texts. On Minoan Crete, while Linear A is unreadable, certain inscriptions on libation tables and ceremonial objects suggest written liturgy. Overall, preserving religious knowledge to maintain the favor of gods and proper ritual continuity was a primary function of early libraries. But even in these very early collections, we find works that go beyond the practical and enter the realm of literature, stories, epics, wisdom, and so forth. Mesopotamia provides the clearest evidence. By the Old Babylonian period, 1900 to 1600 BCE, scribes were copying Sumerian poems and epics. The Epic of Gilgamesh existed in various versions, and many libraries contained copies of it. In Egypt, texts like the story of Sinuhe and the instruction of Ptah-hotep were preserved because scribes kept copying them, often as school exercises. Ugarit in Syria yielded tablets of myths and legends, including the epic Kirta and the Baal cycle, found in private house libraries. Literature in early libraries often served both cultural and educational purposes. Though science was not a separate category in ancient times, early libraries did hold proto-scientific texts. This included medical manuals, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, and reference works. Mesopotamian tablets often compiled lists of medical symptoms and treatments. Early libraries also held omen literature, blending empirical observation with divination. In Egypt, texts like the Kahun Papyrus detail medical practices, and the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus shows geometry problems. Lexical lists and dictionaries are another form of technical literature, such as Ebelite Sumerian bilingual dictionaries that were found at Ebla. So from these categories we can certainly see that the first libraries were pretty comprehensive archives of human activity and thought. They contain the cumulative knowledge, practical, spiritual, cultural, everything that the Bronze Age societies had amassed. Thanks to ancient librarians and scribes, we at least have portions of these surviving. It allows us to read millennia-old stories and state documents, even in our current day. That's pretty special, don't you think? So, Mesopotamia. Like I said, it's the quintessential Bronze Age topic. It's often called the cradle of libraries too, yielding the earliest known archival collections. And believe me, there are tons and tons of those tablets still sitting there in storage in some museum, just waiting to be translated. We got so many that we just can't keep up. And that's just the ones that we've managed to pull out of the ground. Who knows how many more are still out there? We might discover another Epic of Gilgamesh. Who knows? But one of the oldest libraries yet discovered comes from the ancient city of Ebla in northern Syria that we talked about. They excavated it back in the 1970s, and they found a room containing, get this, over 14,000 clay tablets dated to around 2400 BC. These tablets were originally arranged on shelves by subject matter. Although the wooden shelves burned and collapsed, researchers could reconstruct the original order and find spots. Well, Ebla's archive demonstrates that by the mid-3rd millennium BC, a royal court certainly saw it fit to collect and organize knowledge for administrative efficiency and posterity. But further south, other early libraries took shape in temple complexes. Nippur, Mari, and other cities housed tablets that recorded everything from letters between kings to religious hymns. Over time, the idea of collecting texts grew. By the late Bronze Age, Mesopotamian states like Babylonia and Assyria, revered the old knowledge, and scribes copied ancient works onto new tablets. This tradition culminated, in the Iron Age at least, with King Ashurbanipal's vast library at Nineveh, which contained tens of thousands of tablets organized by subject. Although Ashurbanipal lived later, his library built on earlier Bronze Age practices, preserving works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Omen series. In ancient Egypt, libraries took a bit of a different path, closely linked to religious and monumental structures. That house of life, part of a temple complex, was dedicated to writing, storing texts, and teaching. Such houses of life are attested from the Old Kingdom onward. They housed ritual manuals, medical texts, hymns, and scholarly treatises. The Ramesseum papyri, for example, included literary stories, medical prescriptions, and magical texts, possibly from a house of life cache. Pharaohs also maintained state archives for administrative documents. The discovery of the Amarna letters, a cache of around 300 cuneiform tablets in Egypt, reveals that foreign correspondence was carefully archived. We can imagine that domestic administration relied on papyrus scrolls stored in palace libraries. Unfortunately, few of them survive. Scribes held prestigious positions, and their copying of classic tales and religious texts over centuries ensured that these works endured, at least the best they could. The House of Life was regarded as a sacred place, and its collections were sometimes subject to secrecy. And that's just another way that the Egyptians expressed their reverence for written knowledge. Well, the Indus Valley remains a bit of a mystery in this story, I'm afraid. While undoubtedly literate, they left behind thousands of inscribed seals and objects. We have no excavated archive rooms containing texts, nor do we understand the script. Many scholars believe that they wrote on perishable materials that have not survived. Indus inscriptions are typically brief, suggesting a system for labeling or short notations. The lack of decipherment means we cannot identify a scribal class or a library structure. Yet their urban sophistication and standardized seals certainly imply that some form of record-keeping existed. The aforementioned D'Oliveira signboard shows that writing also appeared in a public context. Their libraries remain a mystery, exemplifying how historical record can vanish when scripts and media do not survive. And as for Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece, they provide some of the earliest evidence of libraries in Europe. They used that linear A script for administrative tablets found in the palace archives at Knossos, Zakros, and Phaistos. Later, Mycenaeans adopted linear B, a pretty early form of Greek, for similar palace records at Knossos, Pylos, and other sites. Typically, these archives contained inventories of livestock, grain, weapons, and personnel. Though smaller in scale than Mesopotamian archives, the organized storage of clay documents in dedicated rooms shows that a library archive tradition did exist. Many Linear B tablets, preserved by accidental fires, ironically, reveal a well-developed bureaucracy. The mention of a, quote, tablet keeper, an official at Pylos, suggests that a proto-librarian role existed in Mycenaean palaces. Of course, their texts are mostly administrative, but some hint at possible religious or even literary content. Linear A, though, and the Indus Valley's system of writing. Fingers crossed we'll figure that out one day. Who knows what we'll learn about them. And so, in the Bronze Age societies, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Egypt, Minoan Crete, we can see that emergence of a revolutionary idea that knowledge can be collected, stored, and transmitted beyond individual memory or local time. Now, these first libraries were usually extensions of temples or commercial hubs, yet in serving pragmatic functions, they ultimately preserved epics, myths, medical lore, and scientific observations. By committing words to clay or papyrus, and filing them systematically, Bronze Age scribes laid the foundations for a tradition of learning that endures to this very day. Each region contributed a unique approach. Mesopotamia gave us that extensive tablet archive and a scribal culture that prized copying older works. And in Egypt, the House of Life revealed a sacred dimension of libraries where scrolls were regarded as divine knowledge. The Indus civilization, that remains tantalizingly out of reach, but it reminds us of how easily information can disappear if the medium perishes or if the script is lost, along with giving us a little bit of a dream in the future that we might just figure it out. Meanwhile, Minoan and Mycenaean archives on clay tablets represent Europe's first steps towards recorded language. Together they mark the dawn of the library concept. And so, in every case, scribes stood at the heart of the enterprise, trained professionals who dedicated themselves to writing and organizing texts. Their skill turned ephemeral human speech into a permanent record. And I wonder if they knew that in thousands of years, people would be reading the very tablets that they had marked. That's something to think about. A millennia later, we can still read a lot of these papyrus documents, clay documents. It bridges a remarkable gulf of time. Thus the Bronze Age libraries, though modest in form, were completely monumental in their impact. They told us that knowledge is worth collecting and curating, setting the stage for the great library traditions that followed in the classical and medieval worlds. The very act of writing, saving information, From tax rolls to tales of gods and heroes, it began right there, thousands of years ago. And we owe a debt to these ancient archivists who believe in preserving the written word made civilization's collective memory possible. So pour one out for the scribes, will you? Thank you very much for listening. Well, we sure learned a lot. And we had fun, as we always do. I'm going to thank the top tier supporters, both on Patreon and YouTube. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfitnir, Alexander, Giles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Ryan, Sarah, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Talbury. Thank you so much. Well, if you liked it, you better subscribe to the channel. I suppose you got no other choice, don't you? Somewhat obliged now, getting an hour into the video. Do what you like. But I will see you next time, whenever you feel like returning. Thank you for joining me. As always, lots of love to you all. Good night.